This is Parenting Against the Grain. I hope we're live. It looks like we're live. I'm Amy Webb, the host of the group. If you guys are new, if anybody's new, I did not give a heads up about going live today. I just tend to squeeze these in whenever I get the chance and whenever the kids are not interrupting. They're doing online schooling still. I don't know about your kids. Mine are still primarily online for school. They get to go in a little bit here and there, but mostly online. Um, so yeah, I do these lives. I try to do them about once a week or every 2 weeks, but it's kind of hit or miss lately with the kids being at home. So if you're new to the group, welcome. This group is all about fostering positive parenting and research-based parenting, which focuses on not just sort of going with the flow of what society tells us how to parent, but to actually look into the research and use our own intuition about making good decisions for our kids. So that is what Parenting Against the Grain is all about. So in the group the other day, I posted a poll and a question about what issues people were struggling with and what might be helpful to talk about. And a couple people mentioned um, having sort of what to expect at certain ages, developmentally appropriate expectations, I think. And that I thought that was a great question, first of all, but also it was something I had been pondering for a while and had been wanting to kind of create some sort of resource or printable or something for people because I think it's a huge issue for parents. How do we have appropriate expectations for what we can expect of our kids at different ages? And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit today. And I know there were other people who, in the poll, there was another topic about like positive discipline that a lot of people also were interested in. So I'm going to try to address that in a future video, just FYI. So you know, I'm not ignoring you. So a couple of the questions in the comments talked about kids around the age of 4 or 4.5, and so I'm going to get to that in a second. But first off, I wanted to talk a little bit about why this even matters. Why is it important for us to have developmentally appropriate expectations for our kids and their behavior? This is really something that has been really eye-opening to me as I've been, talked with parents more over the years and seen some of the research. I don't know, y'all are probably familiar with the organization called 0 to 3. They have some great research about this and how they do a lot of surveys of parents and how the expectations that parents have for their kids' behavior are often a little bit off base from what is realistic to expect at different ages. And that's so eye-opening because it really shows like this is the source of so much problem, I think, for for us as parents, because when we expect too much of our kids at a young age, then those expectations are not met and we tend to get upset. So this to me is why it's so important to talk about this, because this can really help us with being more patient with our kids. So just as an example, if we are waiting in a waiting room, like as a doctor's office or something like that, and we are expecting our 2-year-old to sit still without the help of any sort of, device or anything else, and wait patiently for more than a few minutes, that's not realistic, right? So if we expect, oh, my 2-year-old's just going to sit here and wait for us to be called to the doctor's office, and I don't need to come prepared with any sort of books or toys or anything, we're going to be sadly disappointed, and then we're more likely to get upset. And so I think that's where things start to break down, right? In parenting, when we have expectations that our kids cannot meet developmentally, they're not able to meet that. A 2-year-old really cannot sit patiently for more than a couple minutes without some sort of aid for something like a toy, a book, a snack, something, right? It's just not going to happen. And so if we can have more developmentally appropriate expectations coming into situations, then our whole world sort of changes and we go into the situation thinking, okay, I need to be prepared because my toddler will not sit still during this situation. And so I need to maybe bring some things. I need to have, my most patient parenting hat on and, come prepared mentally that this, might be a difficult situation. And so that's one reason why having, appropriate expectations are helpful for us as parents, is that, it just can keep everything a lot more calm if we go into it not expecting so much. And then the other important piece of this, I think, is having appropriate expectations also lets us see our child's behavior for what it is. This is huge. If our toddler is breaking down and, running around or throwing a fit at the doctor's office, it's not because they're a bad kid. It's not because they're being difficult or intentionally trying to push our buttons. It's because they're two, right? And so understanding that and saying, okay, this doesn't make me a bad parent. This doesn't mean my kid is a bad kid. It's just they're two, right? And so going into that and having some grace for yourself and grace for your kids to say, like, this is just what it is to be two or three or whatever it is, then you put the pressure off of yourself. And hopefully, I think we get into these situations oftentimes in public situations, right? Where you feel like people are judging you, like, oh, this person over here who, thinks my kid is bad because they can't sit still in the waiting room. And so if you go into it knowing, okay, this is just how it is to be two, this is normal behavior for a kid this age, and you have to try to manage it the best you can because these are often difficult situations that you don't completely have control over. But then if you feel those eyes judging you, then you can, in your own head at least, like, no, this is not about me. This is not about my kid being a bad kid. This is just what it is to be two. And so I think there's becoming more norms about this, and I think people are becoming more aware that, okay, like, when people are judging us, we don't have to necessarily absorb that, right? We don't have to agree with them in our judgment, in their judgment. And so having these developmentally appropriate expectations can really help with that, and so that you don't feel so uncomfortable, because when you start to feel judged, that's, I think, when parents start to do things that they might not normally do. So if you're at home and your kid is throwing a fit or something, you might tend to be more calm and patient. But when you feel people are judging you in public, then you're like, oh, I have to get this kid under control, and you might do something that you might not normally do. And so I think, all of this goes back to this idea of developmentally appropriate expectations. Um, so I'm going to give a few. These are, I think, some ones that are common that parents have questions about. And of course, if you have questions specifically, and you're watching this later, feel free to put it in the comments and I can try to address it too. These are some ones that I kind of brainstormed and I thought were pretty common that people would often ask. So, like, at what age would you expect kids to be able to share? Okay. So, generally, I would say that was between like 3 and 4. But again, these all have caveats because these skills are an ongoing process, right? So, I would say 3 to 4, they can start to learn how to share. It's going to take still a lot of modeling and explaining. And if it's like a toy that is their most favorite toy, it still might not be, shared very well, and that's understandable. So 3 to 4 is when they really start, kind of understanding that concept of sharing, but it still takes work. Um, when would you expect tantrums to end? This is always a huge question, and I even hesitate to give an answer, honestly. Uh, I would say by 4, they would start to decline. You wouldn't be having tantrums every day, hopefully, at 4. But again, this is very dependent on your child's temperament and their, just overall developmental maturity and the situation. So I would say by 4, they do start to decline, but it's not like an abrupt end. It's not like, okay, at 4 and a half, my kid had their last tantrum and they never had another one. No, I have a 7-year-old and he still sometimes, I wouldn't call it a tantrum. I would call it more of like a meltdown when he gets overwhelmed. But you know, we all have big emotions. I'm in my 40s and I still have meltdowns occasionally. We all do, right? So I would say, but by 4, they would start to kind of taper off and there are not multiple tantrums a day. Be able to resist staying away from an off limits item. So, like, if you're saying, oh, don't touch that glass jar, glass vase that's on the counter, by 3 and a half or 4, they should have the self control to be able to resist that. But again, it's all dependent. If it's something they really want, if it's, they're upset, okay, there's caveats. But I think 3 and a half to 4, they should be able to, at least for a short time, resist touching or getting into some item that's off limits. Okay, this is a good one. Sit patiently um, for a few minutes. So by 3.5, they might be able to sit patiently for 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, and this probably even is with something to do like a book or coloring or something. Okay, that will increase obviously as they develop more self-control and maturity, but again, it's very dependent on their temperament, their activity level, all those things. But you can start to see that increase. Um, and there's things that we can do to help foster these skills. But um, so that's a great example of when we when we have kids that are in preschool or even kindergarten, they're not built to sit still for a long time. So if your child is in a situation in either a daycare or school situation and you find them getting in trouble a lot, or the teacher is calling you and saying, hey, your kid can't sit still or whatever, that's one thing to really look at. Do they have developmentally appropriate expectations at the school or the daycare, wherever they're at? You would hope that a place like that would, a school or a daycare would have that. But there are schools, especially as kids get older, they expect them to sit in desks and sit still for long periods of time. And that is not really an expectation that a lot of kids can meet. There are a few that can. And so that's something to consider if your child is struggling in that type of situation. Manners. So I'm thinking like table manners, sitting at the table, using utensils, there's a lot involved with that. I would say around age 3, you could start trying to promote that and model that. It's going to take work. Again, I have a 7 and 11-year-old, and we're still working on table manners. Okay, so this is an ongoing process. But 3 to 4, they can start. You can start at least for small amounts of time. Maybe they can't sit still for the whole dinner if it's like half an hour, but sitting in their chair more, trying to use utensils when it's appropriate, things like that can start the process. Be aware and kind of empathize with someone else's feelings. This is a huge one because we know from research, there's this test they do in the lab. You may have seen this video. I can post it if you want, but where it's called the theory of mind test, where it assesses how well can a child put themselves in the place of another person, see this situation from another person's perspective. And that's what theory of mind is all about. Like, can I put myself in someone else's shoes? Really, this kids really cannot do this before age around 4. Every once in a while you'll see a kid who's maybe 3.5 that can do this. But if you try to talk to your kid about, oh, how do you think so and so felt when that person teased them, or something that may have happened on the playground or something, they have a really hard time putting themselves in someone else's shoes. Their brain is just not mature enough to handle that. Now, that's not to say that you can't talk about those things and try to encourage them to think about other people's feelings. That's huge, right? But they're not going to completely grasp what it feels like to be that other person. What is that other person experiencing? That's closer to age 4 before they can really understand, okay, I see this, but this other person sees this in a different way. That is a big skill, and that takes some, quite a bit of brain maturity for that to develop. Play a game with rules, so like a board game or a card game. Um, that's closer to age 4. Now, there are some games that are very simple that probably a 3-year-old could play pretty well, right? It just depends on the situation and the game. But if it involves more than a few basic rules, I would say that would be closer to age 4 when they can really do that. Because again, it's sort of, it relates to that perspective taking and that theory of mind, that they have to understand that this other person has a turn and this other person gets to move their piece or whatever the rules are, and then it's their turn. So it's that back and forth that takes a little bit of practice to understand. So those are just a few kind of milestones or issues I think that come up pretty commonly with parenting. Again, if you have some that you're wondering about specifically, you can put those in the comments and I'll try to address those. But like I said, these come with a lot of caveats because I think sometimes we look at these milestones, and all of the child development books have these lists of milestones, right? At age 2, your child should be able to do this and this. And those are helpful, but they're just guidelines, and they're based on large studies of thousands of kids, and this is the average, right? On average, kids at this age would be able to do this. Within that average, there's a lot of variation. And so, a couple of things to be aware of that I think are important. There's I've seen this a lot with my own kids and with friends. Development doesn't always progress the same rate with all the skills, right? So we have cognitive development, language development, social and emotional development, all these different aspects of development. And so sometimes I think a child will get at kind of ahead or be very advanced in one area. Maybe they learn to read really early. Maybe they have really good language skills at an early age. You see those kids who at 2 can like carry on a whole conversation. But then it seems like sometimes what happens is these other areas of development lag a little bit behind because this one area is so advanced. And I don't know for sure if those two things are correlated, but I have seen this happen quite a bit. And so, at least from sort of anecdotal evidence, I think that does happen. So, if you have a child who's very advanced in one area, and then in another area, you're like, I don't understand. They seem so mature in this one way. And yet, when it comes time to whatever, sit still or control their emotions, they really struggle. That is not uncommon for that to happen. I will just say that. Sometimes development is like two different roads and one gets ahead of the other one and there's just no accounting for why exactly that happens. But I think it does happen. So if your child seems more advanced in some areas and less in other areas of development, definitely that would be something you could talk to your pediatrician about for sure. But also, you know, give it some time and see how it progresses over time. And I think, if they need help in a certain area, there's obviously going to be supports that are available for that. But I think that is, not uncommon for a kid who might be advanced in one area to kind of be lacking or behind this quote unquote milestone in another area. So that's just something to consider. If you feel like, oh, I know I've seen this with my own kids. In some ways, they seem so mature. They can carry on a conversation, and they are doing, this work in school that seems so advanced. Seems so advanced in some ways. But then, when it comes time to like sit still, or we go somewhere and they need to be quiet for long periods of time, doesn't happen. And so, this is kind of this asynchronous development, and I think it's not uncommon for that to happen. The other thing, and this is sort of a related issue, is this idea that development is not like one and done. It's a bumpy road. Humans are complex creatures. There's so many factors going into that little brain that is developing in your child, and so there's it's not like, oh well, they quit having tantrums and so they're never going to have another tantrum. No, there's going to be times when they regress. It could be due to a growth spurt, or if they get in a situation where their basic needs are kind of especially hurting. So like if you get really hungry, really tired, sick, those type of things, behavior tends to regress to a past stage of development, right? So, and I think even as adults, we see that in ourselves. If we're especially tired or really we get sick or something like that, then our skills regress too, right? We become like a child again and we just want comfort. And so kids do that too. If you feel like your child has really made all this progress and their, behavior has really changed in the last however many months, and then one day they just, seems like they just totally regress. They're back to throwing tantrums, and, it happens. Development is bumpy. It's up and down. It's take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. I mean, this is just the path of development, I think, is the story there. And so I wouldn't worry too much if it just happens occasionally enough. Of course, you see a pattern of regression in a certain area. That's something to maybe talk about with a professional. But development is a bumpy road, and it takes a lot of patience and a lot of practice and modeling to get those skills to kind of stick, right? Whatever it might be. And then the other thing that's sort of the caveat to these milestones, and if you know me and you've been on this page for a while, this group for a while, I talk about this all the time, is temperament. Certain children with certain temperaments might have easier, an easier time developing certain skills. And so, look at your kid's temperament. Are they really outgoing? Are they very extroverted and social? Are they more introverted, quiet, kind of inhibited? There's many factors, there's other factors that go into temperament besides just that. But if you consider that a little bit and looking at these developmental milestones and developmental issues, so if your child is very active, has a very active temperament, maybe outgoing, maybe very social, those, perhaps those kind of developmental and cognitive milestones that have to do with those types of things might come easier. Language might come easier, perhaps. I'm not saying this is a direct correlation, but whereas something like being able to sit still and control emotions might be harder. If you have a child who has a very intense temperament, who reacts very strongly to things, very strongly to stimulation, and very strongly to the environment, the ability to, self-regulate and control emotions might come a little bit later because that is part of their temperament, right? And you can foster those skills and we can help them, but we can't change who they are. And so that is an issue to think about as we go along with these developmental milestones. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. If any of you have questions as you watch this later, feel free to put them in the comments. I will come back and check those. A couple things to be on your radar as we are talking in this group. I just opened a new resource for everybody. I'm going to start offering parent coaching. It's a new thing for me. It's kind of experimental. So if you're interested in that, you can look on the website, or I can put the link in here. And it's all on over Voxer. So I don't know if you know about the Voxer app. It's a kind of a walkie-talkie app. So that's something, if you're interested in kind of one-on-one support from me to talk about parenting issues, that's something that I just started, and we'll see how that goes if you're interested in that. And then about related to temperament, I just opened up the Temperament Toolkit, which is a set of resources for parents to help you understand all about temperament. So it's audio training, some downloadable printables, an ebook, all packaged together in one resource. So I'll put those links in here if anybody would find those resources helpful. That those are two things that are kind of new to the Thoughtful Parent. And that's all I had for today. Please post your questions. I would love to discuss this more. And I hope you guys have a great day.